AP Human Geography, it's that time again. Test time, chapter 4 and 5. This is going to be covering culture and language. And so here's your study guide that I provide you in class. And there are 41 items on the test study guide. Each item in some way directly reflects what you're going to need to know for the test. And so this is me doing you a big favor if you're going to watch, pay attention, take notes, however you want to do it. I'm going to cover everything. So, I want you guys to know what a material and non-material culture is. What are elements of both of those things? Whenever I ask you for material culture, for example, let's say I ask you to list out a few things. Material culture are things that are going to make up the tangible items, the items that can be held or seen or touched or used by a group of people. If I'm asking you for the material culture of a local group or something that symbolizes that or shows that, maybe paintings or buildings or things like that that would reflect a group of people's local culture. That's what I'm looking for number one. All right, so anything like paintings or buildings or ornaments or pots or different types of tools, things like that would reflect the material. When I'm talking about non-material, I'm in fact talking about things like religion or language or the observance of a holiday or the like a philosophy or some kind that might go along with a cultural idea. Things that are ideas that exist but not actual tangible items. That's what non-material are. Material, non-material, it's just the definitions of the word, right? Applied to culture. So I wanted you guys to know some examples of both of those things. Number 2, Indo-European language family. I want you guys to know language groups of Europe, Romance languages, Germanic, Celtic, so on and so forth. This is the same exact map that I showed you guys that was in your book. This is a PowerPoint that contains the same map. And if you look, this is showing the Indo-European language family, and not only Europe, but also throughout India, the Indo-Iranian language group. What I'm asking you for number 2 is to be familiar with some of the languages that exist in some of the countries that speak Indo-European languages. All right, and so maybe you take a look at the Eastern Europe, right here, Eastern Europe, and Russia are Slavic. You've got Germany and the United Kingdom and Norway and Sweden, Scandinavia. All those are going to be Germanic languages. The Romance language group. Just make sure that you're familiar with some of these, because I'm going to ask you to be able to recognize individual languages from those regions, as well as what countries speak a Indo-European language, for example. And you're going to be able to, well, obviously over here, Kazakhstan, China are not Indo-European. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran are Indo-European, as well as the states of Europe. So please be aware of this map and just kind of have an idea of what big countries or what regions speak an Indo-European language, because I am going to ask you a question directly related to that. That being said, know that Chinese is a Sino-Tibetan language. It's part of the Sino-Tibetan language family and not Indo-European. I'm going to ask you a question related to that as well. Give examples of cultural landscape. Know how to define cultural landscape. Well, let's talk about that for a second. According to National Geographic, the cultural landscape is a landscape that people have modified, and in other words, something that has been influenced and adapted by humankind. And so I'm going to ask you on your test to be able to not only define what the cultural landscape is, but also to be able to perhaps give examples. Stuff like maybe the Adobe ruins, maybe the Great Pyramids, anything, or maybe even something as simple as cemeteries and churches or mosques. These are all elements of the cultural landscape, or things that reflect or are a reflection of people's culture on Earth. That's what I'm looking for the cultural landscape right there. I want you to be able to give me examples of and provide examples and understand elements of pop culture. What do we mean by that? Well, what are things that reflect pop culture? Pop culture is things that are popular. Cultural items that are meant to be, 1, money makers, and 2, very entertaining. We've already spent a lot of time talking about this. Music, the diffusion of jeans, for example, that people wear, different other types of clothing styles. Movies, pop culture movies, or big time money making movies. Sometimes even literature. All these things are elements of, or things that will go into what pop culture is. The diffusion of pop culture has had impacts on the way that the Western cultures are perceived in terms of a globalized world. We talked about things like K-pop, which are the reterritorialization of Western ideas made into now like a kind of have somewhat of an Asian originality to it and widely diffused throughout Asia. But in terms of Western culture in and of itself, well, we're kind of perceived. Well, let's see. Many times, Western culture has been diffused through and have been adopted by other groups. Right? So there are some groups that are receptive to Western culture and how we can help them from an education standpoint, help them from an entertainment or from a money-making standpoint. A lot of people that want to make it big, for example, go into international business or different types of things where they deal a lot in Western type things. And so you want to be more educated. Some groups have been very, very likely to adopt these things. Some other areas in the world may have resisted Western culture. For example, if you look in the Middle East, there's a lot of resistance to our culture because they think it's perhaps a blemish on their own culture or on Islam. Other places as well have rejected Western culture for similar reasons. There's backlash. There's groups that reject Western culture to the point of violence. There's also this element or this idea that Western culture is often spread through movies and other forms of media, like Facebook, which is part of the reason why China has been so closed to the idea of allowing their people to have Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and things like that are international in scale. They have local versions of these things in China. But those are things I want you to know about how Western world is globalized or how are we perceived throughout the world. So it brings us to the next point. I'm asking you guys about culture. What is culture? I'm also asking you about cultural characteristics. What are some things that we characterize culture by? I know what you guys are all thinking. Everyone's thinking, "Oh, Mr. Fowler, I know what culture is. It's a way of life of a group of people." Great. Well, we're going to look at that. Culture is the traditions, the beliefs of a group. It's the way that a group identifies. It's the learned behavior that's passed from one generation to the next. It is made up of always changing factors. It's very dynamic. It's always changing. There's also this idea that traits are a reflection of a group's values. For example, we were talking today about religion and how religion is very important to us. Even if we're not religious, our society has largely been impacted and influenced by Christianity and Judeo-Christian values. What is a cultural complex? Well, a cultural complex is a group of related cultural traits, essentially. That's basically what it is. Now, that begs the question, what is a cultural trait? As we can see here, there's also another one of the words that I want you guys to be familiar with. So, a cultural trait is basically a single attribute of culture, or a single thing that could be defined as a part of one's culture. The next question or next item on the list is cultural realm, or our written culture realm. Same difference here, but what we're looking at is the entire region throughout which this culture prevails. And if you look at that, what that would look like in images is, well, we did an assignment the other day where I showed you something like this. Well, something like this here that shows the different realms or different cultural, for some reason I can't get my computer to pull up, but what it would do is it would demonstrate different regions like Anglo-America or Latin America or Austro-European for the region of Australia and some of those areas in Oceania. These are different cultural realms where people are related in those small regions by some facets that pull them together culturally and separate them from the rest. We've already looked at cultural landscape as something that describes how people are going to adapt the land to meet their needs, or is going to be a reflection of the culture on land. But cultural hearth is more than that even. Cultural hearth is just the origin of a culture or of a cultural idea. We talked about the hearth of the Indo-European language. We talked about the original 4 hearths of civilization. A hearth is just a point of origin. So a culture hearth is the point in which a culture or a cultural group is going to originate. Finally, cultural trait. Actually, we just looked at cultural trait, which, just to remind you, is a single attribute of a cultural group, or some single attribute of culture. Ethnocentrism. We were looking up here at this Western culture in globalization, and we had talked a little bit about how Western culture is perceived. Well, ethnocentrism is the idea that one might view their own culture as greater or better than others. And so, early on, Western powers, especially during colonial times and all that, would set up these whole empires on the notion that Western culture is better than everyone else. And so we try to impose that upon people in the United States, our Native Americans, other cultural groups that we've tried to oppress through imperialism of some kind. And even today, the world, some people in the world consider us to be ethnocentric because of our idea that, we Americans tend to have this feeling that we're, well, I'm not even going to go into that. It's not really important. But ethnocentrism, that's what it means right there. What is commodification? Well, anytime that you take an item or something that belongs to a local group, that's normally just a part of their traditions or maybe something that they do or partake in, and make it into an item to be bought or sold, that's commodification. And so we looked at that a little bit in class, but I think I'm just going to ask you nothing more than the definition there. I'm not going to ask you to apply that. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Item 15, I want you to be able to differentiate between cultural possibilism and environmental determinism. This is something that we kind of revisited. Early on in the class, we looked at these 2 concepts. Cultural possibilism is the idea that we are able to, as people, to adapt the world around us to meet our needs, and that the environment does not determine who we are or how intelligent we are or what we're capable of. Whereas environmental determinism is the opposite. It is the idea that people are controlled and manipulated by their environment and not the other way around. So a lot of earlier scientists used this as an excuse or as justification for why maybe some cultures were better or greater than others. That's the idea of environmental determinism, and it's largely not accepted anymore among geography scholars of geography. What is cultural diffusion? Well, we talked about several different forms of diffusion. Let's look at this a little closer. Cultural diffusion is basically the spread of ideas or of a cultural group from one place to another or from one group to another. And a lot of times, culture is going to, well, actually all the time, culture is going to diffuse in one of 4 basic different ways, and that is relocation. People are going to move from one place to another and take their culture with them. That's the different types of expansion diffusion, hierarchical, through cities to suburban to lesser populated to rural. That's one form of hierarchical, or also from important people. There's stimulus diffusion, like where one thing will pick up and carry with one culture that didn't work with the point of origin. And then there's also the idea of contagious diffusion, which is where an idea will spread like a disease. It's contagious. People catch it by being close to it. All right. So those are the different ways that culture might diffuse. What is cultural assimilation? Well, if something is assimilated, that means that it is completely enveloped or completely changed. Wikipedia is going to look at cultural assimilation as the process by which a person or a group's language or culture come to resemble those of another group. In other words, the one culture of the weaker culture or the lesser culture, weaker, is going to be completely assimilated, completely enveloped, and completely changed into the dominant culture's way. Kind of like cultural assimilation is this idea of acculturation, except it's not as severe. Acculturation is only when uh, some of the traits of a more dominant culture have been adopted into the lesser cultures or the weaker culture's way of life. So acculturation and cultural assimilation are similar, except assimilation is when the culture of the weaker is completely made into the culture of the greater. You see this a lot in China, ironically, as groups would conquer the Chinese, they would become like the Chinese as they established dynasties. It's kind of weird. What is cultural imperialism? What is cultural imperialism? It's kind of this idea that pop culture, through globalization or globalizing forces, tends to conquer or imperialize or throw itself into or over local cultures and customs. Local languages that don't have a written tradition or don't have a scholastic tradition tends to be overshadowed by larger languages like English and French, where people can seek out better education or better opportunities. So oftentimes, in order to succeed, people might need to throw aside their culture in a globalizing world and adopt that of the bigger or the mainstream or the popular for the sake of making it up. And so this idea that the pop culture tends to trump or throw out or conquer local cultures is kind of the idea of cultural imperialism. Now, number 20, that's pretty vague, isn't it? What do I mean by the spread of languages? Well, several things is what I mean by that. Well, if you look at the spread of the Indo-European language, you can see that its reach is fairly far and wide. If you look at this map here, which I know is kind of hard to see, but you have a line drawn around the different countries on Earth or continents or regions that speak in some form or fashion an Indo-European language of some kind. And so you can see that languages have spread substantially. How did they spread? They spread through all sorts of things like conquest, through religion. They spread through social media more rapidly, and movies and Western culture and all sorts of things like that. So I want you guys to be able to tell me that languages spread through all those ways, through conquest, through imperialization, through cooperation, through movies, through social media, through warfare, any of those things. Okay? What is an isolated language? I wanted you to give me a definition and an example of that. And so the best example that we talked about is the Basque language, Euskera. And what an isolated language is basically just that. It's a language that exists right there among other languages, but is not in any way related to them. Let me show you a map. Bam! What this is this a map that kind of shows the situation here of the Basque country, all right? Basque Autonomous Community. And what this is these different colors represent the Basque people in this little area here. I'm not going to ask you to be able to really have to break this down and everything, but I want you to know that the Basque people speak their own separate, isolated language. Everyone else in Europe is speaking Indo-European. These guys here are speaking Euskera, which is a language that's not in any way related to the Indo-European language. And so that's one thing that definitely separates the Basque and their language from the rest of Europe. So it's a good example of an isolated language. Number 22, I wanted to talk to you guys about Quebec. Know that the people of Quebec, the Quebecois, are actually French speakers and are very much culturally different from the rest of Canada and, for that matter, the rest of the United States. These guys go back to way down during the times of imperialization or exploration, when the French actually had colonies established in North America, and these guys go back that far. Are they like the French? They're, I guess, a good way to look at it, maybe not quite, is that they're about as different, maybe a little more so than we are from the English. All right, so it's kind of like that. They're not French, but they're definitely not American, not Canadian, in that they associate themselves with French culture and they speak French at home. Identify Romance languages. We spent a lot of time looking at some maps already. I wanted you guys, though, basically to be able to tell me what are some of the Romance languages. If I give you guys a list, be able to pick them out. Please know that English is a Germanic language. Number 24. It's not a Romance language, even though the English language was very much heavily influenced by the French during the time that the Normans invaded England. All right, so, and that's number 25. What impact did the French language have on the English? A lot. A lot of our more fancy words, for example, come from French and have some kind of Latin-looking roots, but for the sake of the language and for the sake of what we're doing, English is a Germanic language, not Romance. So please don't get that mixed up. What are some other examples of Romance and Germanic languages that I want you guys to know? There's some right there. We talked about them in class. Romance languages, mainly just the big five, all right? French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese. There are others listed out in a map in your book. I'm not worried so much about those. I want you guys to know those ones right there. Germanic languages, English, German, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish are a few examples. And Slavic, the big one here is Russian, all right? Polish, Czech, Slovak, Ukrainian, Slovenian, and so on. All right, so just know maybe 2 or 3 of each of those. Make sure you guys can identify them if I ask you a multiple choice question to be able to choose them from a list. All right, so moving on. The Chinese writing system is well, they use ideograms to do their writing. It's not an alphabet. Each different ideogram or each different symbol within their writing system represents a sound or different ideas. There's a lot of these that exist in, for example, Chinese, which is a good example of ideogrammic writing, which we just now, actually what it says for number 26. They don't just have to learn how to put together 26 symbols to make their words. They have thousands of different characters that have different meanings. This kind of makes Chinese a little bit more difficult to learn. A lot of people struggle, especially if they don't learn it as an original language. And even in China, the different dialects are bound together by the writing system. That's kind of a cool little fact. Number 27, what is an isogloss? A lot of vocabulary on this section here. An isogloss is simply a barrier or a boundary in which you might see one word spoken one way and then somewhere else the language or the dialect is going to yield a different word for the same concept. Let me show you what I mean. There's the definition according to the PowerPoint that we looked at. Isogloss is a geographic boundary within which a particular linguistic feature occurs. And here's a map that shows you some of the ones we looked at in class. Bam, there it is. Common name for a soft drink. In the yellow, they call them a pop. In blue, soda, so on and so forth. You guys can read that. Here's another look at the same concept by county. Okay, that's one example of an isogloss. Other different types of word usage and dialect differences we talked about include the use of the word pancake or flapjack or griddle cake or whatever you might want to call those. And so that's isoglosses. What is a dialect exactly? Well, dialects are regional variants, or I guess variants of a standard language along regional or ethnic lines. Dialects are going to include differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, so on, just like you see right there in the PowerPoint we looked at. And so what's the most obvious thing with a dialect? Well, what stands out the most is the difference of the way that they have an accent, or the different dialects or sound different coming out of the mouths of people that speak them. So that's basically all I really need you guys to know for a dialect. Moving on to language family. Moving on to language family. If you look at an ethnologue, there are more language families than you could possibly ever need to know for this. But for the sake of simplicity, this here is the language families of the world. It is a map that shows Indo-European, which is the most widely spoken by over half the world today. You've got other language families listed out here. But I basically just want you to know what a language family is. I don't necessarily need you to memorize them, even though we have spent a lot of time talking about Indo-European, and I do kind of want y'all to be familiar with that. Language families are, well, you can look here on this page in this particular book and define it. Like species, some languages are related and others are not. At a global scale, we classify languages into language families. Your textbook says that a language family is a collection of languages related to each other through a common ancestor long before recorded history. That's on page 167 in the glossary section of the chapter 5 dealing with language. And so that's a pretty good definition. That should be enough for you to know. So that's actually all we're going to talk about with that one. We're going to move on. Language branch is also defined on that same page, as is language group. Now, some books or some geographers call language groups are basically the same as subfamilies, but if as long as you know the definition for a language group defined in the book, you should be fine with number 31, 30 and 31. 32, characteristics of dialects. Let's talk about that for a sec. I basically want you guys to know some of the differences in terms of the dialect of the American English and dialect of English or English of the UK. And those differences include different pronunciation of words, different spelling of words, different vocabulary for different vocabulary for some objects, or different language of origin. So I want no, never mind that last little piece. But nonetheless, I want you guys to know that those are some of the same characteristics that are different among all dialects. Dialects are, like I said, regional variants, and so from place to place, over time, those dialects are going to stand out and become different, even though they are the same language. There is no different language of origin. That's one thing I wanted to emphasize, just because I just kind of misspoke there. American English and British English both derive from the same Germanic group of Indo-European that eventually became English. We speak the same language, just a different dialect. Right? So please don't miss that one if you're asked on a test. So, what is a lingua franca? A lingua franca is a common language spoken among two different groups for the sake of communication of any kind, whether it's business or whatnot. For example, I read a book in college called The Map of Love, and it was actually a pretty good book. I don't remember a whole lot about it, other than I was pretty well entertained when I was reading it, but it was about an English woman who settles down in Egypt and during the late 1800s or something like that, and then the Egyptian she falls in love with, his home language, his native language is Arabic, obviously, but he speaks French and she speaks French, and so they were able to use that as a lingua franca between the two of them, and I guess that's what they spoke whenever they got married or whatnot. A pidgin language is like a simplified, almost baby talk kind of version of a language used for the sake of basic communication between groups. And a Creole is a pidgin language that becomes essentially the first spoken language, or the language that people are going to start to learn over a few generations. Once it becomes the first language of a generational group, that's when it becomes a Creole. And we looked at examples of that, but I'm not really going to ask you for examples of Creole languages, even though I do want you to know that maybe Haiti, during the times of French imperialization of that area, many of the Africans spoke of some kind of a Creole language that was basically an African language mixed with French. And so that's one good example, but I'm not going to ask you to know that much detail. Examples of revived languages include Hebrew, Welsh. You can look at some Native American languages like Cherokee. There's been great efforts lately to teach kids how to read and write in Cherokee language and kind of revive that language, and that's kind of cool. So these are all revived languages that within the last 50 years or so have made great strides at becoming more widely spoken and more culturally alive than ever before. Euskera. We already talked about the Basque. I showed you guys a map. It's right here. Euskera is a language that would have been spoken by the Basque people, so please make sure that you know that. Now, let's look at number 38. We didn't talk a whole lot about this in class. I still want you to know it. That's why I'm sitting here making this video, is because this is some important stuff, and you will likely see this on some form of the AP exam, because it's a big deal. And that is the idea that Belgium is a multi-linguistic state. Let's talk about it. Okay, so Belgium is made up of basically three big chunks based on language spoken. And really the two biggest regions within Belgium, where there's going to be some language disputes, is going to be Flanders and Wallonia. Now, you've also got a little purple section over here on the side, on the eastern side, where people are going to speak German. And so you've got three big European languages being represented in Belgium. Um, and so I wanted you guys to be able to identify that, and also I wanted you to be able to tell me a little bit about the situation in Belgium because of this. Just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about Belgium and the issue with Flanders and Wallonia. If you look on page 159 in your textbook, there's a section there about multilingual states that gets into some pretty good detail about the issues with language in Belgium. And so, what are some of these issues? I'm actually going to read a segment. Luckily for you, if you guys want, you can fast forward or rewind or however you want to do it, but I would definitely pay attention or look at these pages yourself so you can understand how the language has impacted the politics in Belgium. Check it out. Um, the southern Belgians are known as Walloons, and they speak French. Northern Belgians are known as Flanders, and they speak Flemish, which is a Germanic language. It's actually is Dutch, basically, the language of the Netherlands. And so these people are speaking different languages and are very, very tied together ethnically by their different language. Okay, once you get to the boundary that exists right here between Flanders and Wallonia, you go very abruptly, actually, from speaking French to speaking Flemish, right? With the only exception being Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium, also a big UN capital. But I wanted to say that this is a very bilingual section here, where French and Flemish are both spoken very widely. Because and what they would do is they would put signs in both languages, as you can see here from the image on the screen. Right, so that's one place, but you've got signs on the left and on the right that are in different languages, one in Flemish, one in French. I can't speak either one. So, what else can we take about this? Well, these guys are very politically and economically different, with the also including their language. So it's not just language, but ironically, economic and political differences exist here too by the language groups. Traditionally, Wallonia in the south has typically been the most prosperous of the two. According to this source here and others that are online, you guys could easily access, southern Belgium, Wallonia, had become like an industrial center in the early 1900s and had actually more prosperity than Flanders. But over time, the switch, as most developed countries have made the switch from manufacturing sectors into tertiary or service sectors type of jobs, service jobs. Flanders actually ended up becoming the top dog out of the two, and so I guess, well, I don't know if you could say unfortunately, but for however it may add up, Wallonia had enough influence in Brussels that the majority of people in Brussels still speak French, but Flanders is a far more economically prosperous place to live in today. And so your book actually mentions that, well, let me read a section here. Antagonism between the Flemish and the Walloons is aggravated by economic and political differences. Historically, the Walloons dominated Belgium's economy and politics, and French was the official state language. Motorists in Belgium clearly see the language boundary on the expressways. Heading north, the highway signs suddenly change from French to Flemish at the boundary between Wallonia and Flanders. Brussels, the capital city, is an exception. Although located in Flanders, Brussels is officially bilingual, and signs are in both French and Flemish. As an example, some stations on the subway map of Brussels are identified by two names, one French and one Flemish. In response to pressure from Flemish speakers, Belgium has been divided into two independent regions. So Belgium is a state in and of itself, but both Flanders and Wallonia seem to have some degree of autonomy based on their language differences. Each elects an assembly that controls cultural affairs, public health, road construction, and urban development in its region. But for many in Flanders, regional autonomy is not enough. They want to see Belgium divided into two independent countries. were that to occur, Flanders would be one of Europe's richest countries, and Wallonia would be one of the poorest. That would also cause problems because the French speakers in Brussels, which is the majority of the people there, would not have any of it when it comes to having to switch out and be Flemish culturally and be part of Flanders. So I don't think that's ever really going to happen where the two become a separate state because of that reason, if for nothing else. But let's look a little bit closer. In this book here, it mentions that economic differences between linguistic groups have been a divisive issue for generations, and it goes more into detail. It says that by the 1960s, a fixed partition scheme came into being, talking about the boundary between the two. The government recognizes Brussels as a distinct region, a bilingual capital. So, looking a little bit further down, after the 1960s, Belgian heavy industry became less competitive, and the country's economy shifted from high technology, light industry, and services, with much of the new economy concentrated in Flemish-speaking Flanders. As a result, the economic power flipped in Belgium, with French-speaking industrial South taking a back seat to the Flemish-speaking North. So it goes on to say Wallonia has a 14% unemployment rate, and that, in fact, Flanders has a less than 6% unemployment rate, again, showing how prosperous it is in comparison to Wallonia, which causes political and not just linguistic, but political and economic problems. So I want you to be familiar with the problems, economic and political problems that exist within Belgium from the standpoint of the language. Okay, so know the conflict between Wallonia and Flanders is essentially what I'm asking you to do. Okay, where did my stuff go? There we go. All right, so okay, eventually I'll get set up. There we go. I also want you to be familiar with efforts to revive languages for cultural preservation. So there are people out there that are trying to work to provide written language for languages that don't have written languages. There are people that are trying to work to save cultures by saving and preserving languages. We might talk a little bit more about that in class, actually. Don't worry about 39 right now so much, because we really haven't talked much about that, and so I may not have you be responsible for it. Number 40, the diffusion of Indo-European language family. I want you to be able to show me, or I've already shown you guys several times a map that talks about the diffusion of Indo-European language. In particular, I'm looking at the cultural hearth, the point of origin of the Proto-Indo-European language. Let me show you. This here is a figure 6-12 is the map that I showed you guys in class about the Indo-European language hearth and dispersal hypothesis. And it's more popular than the Western dispersal because it also kind of really does the same thing, except most historians, most linguists believe that this is the proposed path of the earliest diffusion of the Indo-European language into Western Europe. It also supports the possibility that perhaps some people did travel westward from Anatolia, and also shows how these people up here will have spoken Indo-European language. I want you to be familiar with the spread of the Indo-European language from a proposed hearth in Anatolia or the Caucasus Mountains. And I also want you to be able to understand the Indo-European languages of Europe, and then how, because of exploration and imperialization, different groups of people worldwide, like the United States or like other parts of East Asia or even Latin America, now speak an Indo-European language, or a language that has derived itself from the Indo-European language family. That's basically what I'm asking you to do for that one. Last but not least, I wanted you to tell me about Dolgopolsky and Svitek. We already talked about these people and did an assignment based on them. If you look in the textbook that we looked at for the class, you will see both of them in, let's see. Right here in this section, talking about the deep reconstruction and the efforts to reconstruct and create the Nostratic language and the Proto-Indo-European language. Both of these people played an important role, and I want you guys to be familiar with the important role they played. If you look right here, it mentions, let's read here from this whole thing about backwards reconstruction. Linguists use a technique called backwards reconstruction, and it tells you what that is. They're able to create extinct languages using a technique called deep reconstruction. The work of two Russian scholars in particular had great impact on deep reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European language and even the ancestral language of the Proto-Indo-European language. Mr. Svitek and Mr. Dolgopolsky began working in the 1960s, each of them using deep reconstruction. They worked independently of each other. They didn't realize that both of them were doing the same thing. They used using words they assumed to be the most stable and dependable parts of a language's vocabulary, such as identifying arms, legs, feet, and other bodies. They reconstructed an inventory of several hundred words. When they finally met and compared their inventories, they found that the inventories were amazingly similar. The scholars agreed that they had established some key characteristics of not only Proto-Indo-European, but also of its ancestor, the Nostratic language. So go ahead also read this section here where it talks about the Nostratic vocabulary, and because I wanted you guys to be a little bit familiar with those people and the work that they did in case I ask you questions about that. So that said, that's it. That's your test is going to be on all that stuff right there. We covered the material for not only the multiple choice, but also for potential free response questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me and go ahead and get started on studying. It never hurts to start early, but if you start too late and procrastinate, you are going to be overwhelmed and have too much to do and not do so well on the test. So good luck, and I believe in all of you. Thank you.